Even before Hamas's October 7th attack, Israel has been at the center of conflict. But this isn't just a geopolitical issue, it's theopolitical. Join us, Dr. Jeff Myers, on the Jewish Road podcast.
Every tribe, every tongue, Emmanuel, your king shall come. End of sorrows, end of pain, come and praise Creator's name.
Well, welcome to the Jewish Road podcast. My name is Matt Davis.
I'm Ron Davis.
And we're here with a very special guest, Dr. Jeff Myers from Summit Ministries. Hello, Dr. Myers.
Hey, guys. You have a great set. I really like that with the bookshelf in the back. I sort of like books, too. You might be able to tell from my background.
Yeah, just a little bit. We're real excited to talk to you. We actually got to spend a little bit of time together out in Colorado, beautiful Colorado, on the campus of Summit Ministries. Give us, for those who are listening, never heard of Summit Ministries, what is this ministry all about?
This ministry is formed in 1962 by David Noble to help young adults figure out how to get a biblical Christian worldview. And that's what we do to this day for about 70,000 young people every year in curriculum courses and in-person programs. We equip them and support them to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. So just next door, there are 185 students right now in an antique hotel in this little town that you visited, this little hippie town of Manitou Springs, Colorado. And they are learning a biblical worldview. I just finished with them actually speaking about is there a Christian biblical worldview of politics? So that was a very interesting topic given recent events.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. So you wrote a book that maybe is outside the realm of what you would normally write, but it was inspired by a trip that you took to Israel in January.
Yeah.
Give us some perspective on that.
Well, I care a lot about this rising generation. I'm a Gen X guy. I worked with people in my own generation. I had the opportunity to work with millennials, have now the opportunity to work with those who are in Gen Z. Generations are primarily defined by their access to technology. And what's characteristic of Gen Z is that they have access to so many things that could make their lives better. But more than other generations previous to them, they struggle with a sense of purpose. 75% say they don't have a sense of purpose. 50% say they regularly struggle with anxiety and depression. So I think a lot and spend a lot of time surveying them, looking at polls, talking to students, trying to figure out what's going on, what they believe, what's important to them, and how they might grow to be more like Christ. And in October 7th, after the terrorist attacks from Hamas on Israel, I saw a poll come out from Harvard University, their CAPS program, saying that 51% in the battle between Hamas and Israel sided with Hamas.
Yeah.
It specifically said Hamas has done these things. They've murdered 1,200 people and taken 250 more captive. Do you think that is justified based on Palestinian grievances? And 51% of young Americans said yes. I tracked that for a couple more weeks. They redid the survey in December. This is Mark Penn, who's the pollster. Okay, he's one of the most legendary pollsters in the entire country. And I intuitively, I don't agree with him politically, but I trust him when he comes up with questions. He's very good. The number rose to 60%. I was so shocked that 60% of young Americans would support an apocalyptic rape and death cult over an ally of the United States that I knew I had to do something. So I wrote an opinion editorial piece for Daily Wire. And I called it, "Congratulations, America, you've raised a generation of terrorist sympathizers." That got a lot of attention and led to an opportunity to travel to the land in the middle of January, 100 days after the October 7th attacks, to spend time in the war zone. I specifically went there because I wanted to interview and spend time with people in the IDF. These are citizen soldiers, with victims' families, with survivors, with hostage families, and with intelligence officers and journalists who could help give me a sense of what was going on. So I spent several days in the land, some of it, with a Kevlar helmet and vest, bulletproof vest because we were that close to Gaza that a well-positioned sniper could easily have taken us out. Feeling, listening to the artillery shells flying overhead on their way to targets, terrorist hideouts in Gaza, and felt that when I came back, somebody has got to speak of the truth in this situation.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what all that truth was. I knew what young adults were telling me, that Israel's an oppressor, that Hamas represents an oppressed people group, therefore they're more righteous. I knew young people were telling me that they didn't think this was a just war. They were asking questions about proportionality. So many more Gazans have died than Israelis. How's that possibly fair? And those kinds of questions. So those are the questions I brought with me. And I found, unlike a lot of places I've been into other places that were, they had recently been through a war or had an ongoing war, and you do not get clear answers on anything. I found especially among the Jews who were Israeli citizens and the Arabs who were Israeli citizens, a forthrightness that was very refreshing. They had a sense of we that we don't experience in this country. And yet they were willing to tell me what they were frustrated with, what they appreciated, what bound them together in spite of their differences.
So I'm curious, what was your Israel awareness before this moment? Had you ever gone before? I know that the place of the Bible obviously takes place in Israel, but as far as this battle and this struggle, was this an awakening for you? Or was this just maybe a side curiosity that finally got risen to the top?
I had been to the land twice before. Once I thought was in 2009. The passport agent corrected me and said it was 2008. And then again in 2022, I had been in the land. So I had been there. So that was relatively recently. My trip in 2022 would have been 13 months before my trip to the war zone. So it had been relatively recent, and I'd been there with a group. We spent, it was maybe 10 days. It was an intensive study tour. So I did have that familiarity. I also understood a lot about the Israeli government because I have a number of friends who are Orthodox Jews in this country and in Israel, and also some friends who are Messianic Jews who are there in Israel. So I had spent a lot of time, I got to know those individuals and had been in contact with them throughout to understand what was happening. But the reason I needed to go, I believed, back in January, is not because it was safe. I thought it would be safe, but obviously if you're in the middle of a war zone, even if you're in a place where the enemy has been pushed back, it's never really safe. Right. When you're in southern Israel, if Hamas were to launch a rocket, you have 7 seconds to take cover. 7 seconds. And there is no Iron Dome coming to your defense because they can't get the counter missiles up in the air that fast. I would say the reason I felt I needed to go is because I needed to come back and somehow give an accounting to this generation of young adults I work with. I knew I'm going to be, this year, 2024, I'm going to be working 70,000 of these young people. I owe them answers. I need to demonstrate how a biblical worldview applies to what seems to be an impossible situation. Because so many situations in our lives seem impossible. And yet, I think we're commanded to teach people to obey God, even in those situations.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, as you're talking about this younger generation, I'm thinking to myself that there is so much propaganda and lies that they are susceptible to. And, some of the stuff that happened almost immediately after October 7th was just the reverse of what the truth was on the whole thing. And how are you finding dealing with those realities with the young people that you're in contact with when you come back?
I don't know how successful I have been because the young adults I'm with, they will ask very challenging questions. Nobody in the media has asked harder questions than now close to 1,000 students that I've had personal Q&A dialogues with this summer in smaller groups, repeatedly over and over again with different groups. They ask really tough questions. I don't know how persuaded they are. I think probably by the time we finish, 90% of them are persuaded to forsake their anti-Israel stance that they had maintained for the sake of being anti-Israel. I'm not asking them to put their stamp on everything that Israel does. Right. I'm an American. I don't put my stamp on everything America's leaders do. Right. I wouldn't expect that I would be asking people to do that for Israel.
Right.
But to bring truth where you, as you mentioned, Ron, that there is propaganda. So I think the students are being persuaded. And I guess I have one little bit bigger perspective on that. Back in March, I conducted a poll. You know the pollster Scott Rasmussen, my favorite. So we did a poll with Scott and with his company, RNG. And we found that when we asked a question, young people would give their answer, and then we would ask a follow-up question to those who had answered a certain way to see if the presentation of a fact changed their mind. And I can give you a couple of answers. One, we asked, do you believe that Israel's greater military power and wealth makes their cause against Hamas unjust?
Right.
And 47% of young adults said, yes, it's unjust. Then we asked them, do you think, based on the fact that Hamas leaders have all become millionaires and billionaires by skimming off of international aid designated for destitute Gazans, does that make their cause unjust? And 57% who had just said Israel's unjust now said Hamas is unjust. And a very high percentage of them were cast into indecision. We asked a similar question about the two-state solution. Do you think that Israel should be forced into a two-state solution? And more than half of young adults said yes, they should. And then the follow-up question, only to those who said yes, Israel should be forced into it, we asked them, do you, based on the fact that Palestinian leaders have rejected a Palestinian state every time it's been offered in 1948, 1967, 2000, 2008, do you think that Israel should be forced to do this? And 57% of those who had previously said yes still said yes. Mm-hmm. But 30-some% said no, and a very high percentage of them were cast into confusion. When somebody believes something wrong, for them to become confused is better.
Yeah,
that's good.
A third of them changed their mind in one question with the presentation of one fact. Yeah. And that's when I realized I think we need to rethink a lot of this, because a lot of young people just instinctively say, well, the Palestinians are the underdog, therefore Israel's evil. They've been taught to think that way. They have an oppressor versus oppressed mindset, kill the oppressors, and the oppressed will be free. They've embraced this.
Yep.
So they instinctively apply it. But when you give a fact and they have to consider the reality of the situation, they very quickly are cast into decision or change their mind. To me, that's the real hope. It's a very long way of getting to that answer, but I felt like giving those facts surrounding it might be helpful.
That was great. It brings up, even with the idea of the two-state solution, we're accustomed to this term geopolitical. And when we were first introduced to your book and what you're doing through it, this word jumped out on the page was theopolitical. It actually made this guy do a double take. Because he's political and he's theological, but he never put the two together. And I think we're taught that we have to actually separate those.
Yeah. No.
He would say no. So what does that mean? And what's the implication of that? How does it go against this idea of geopolitical? You talk about that in the book. I loved it.
Well, I have to think of who I picked that term up from. I think the first time I had a discussion about that was either with an intelligence officer in the IDF, Itamar Ben-David, or with Rabbi Jerome Perez from the Mizrahi Foundation. But one of those two, they kind of used that term, and I drilled down on it. But a geopolitical conflict is a conflict over territory, over actual land, the value of the land. To a materialist, that's all that matters, because, of course, a materialist believes that only the physical world exists. There's nothing outside the physical world. So it's all about land.
So if this was just a geopolitical issue, it might be able to be solved. But what we're saying is it's more than geopolitical.
If it was just a geopolitical issue in the minds of Jews and the Palestinian Muslims, it would have been solved. It would have been solved in 1948. Right. But it's never just been about that. It's been about everything. So the idea of a geopolitical conflicts, That an example of geopolitical conflict would be Israel and Egypt. Their borders were fairly well defined. Egypt attacked. Israel took back some of that ground. They were able to negotiate an arrangement whereby America would give a certain amount of money to Israel every year and a certain amount of money to Egypt every year. I think that figure is now something like $3 billion a year that we give, that they just agreed not to attack each other.
Jeez.
And I actually think that they agree to use most of that money to buy weapons from us so that they both feel more secure. Anyhow, it's just, that's how geopolitical agreements work out. Theopolitical conflicts, on the other hand, are about varying understandings of religious truth. So how do you understand God? Because what you believe about God will determine what you believe about everything else.
Yeah, it's more ideological.
It's very ideological. Even among secular Jews, there's a very distinct understanding of what Judaism means. Among Muslims, there is a very strong sense. Obviously, there are two major groupings of Muslims, and we can talk about that if you want, but there is a very strong sense that no land that has ever been conquered on behalf of the Prophet must ever be forfeited.
Right, right.
It is an affront to Allah that Israel exists.
Yep.
And some people make it apocalyptic. So Iran is the Iranian leaders are a kind of Muslim called Shia. Everybody who's listening has heard of Shiite Muslims. Those are the Iranians. Right. They are apocalyptic. They're kind of like the Muslim end times people, but they believe they can bring about the end times. They believe there will be coming a prophet called the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi. And when he arrives, he will force the entire world to submit to Allah as prescribed by Islamic writings. Mm-hmm. The only thing standing in the way of that is the existence of the state of Israel. So as far as Iran is concerned, they cannot achieve their desired apocalyptic aims as long as Israel exists. If you don't understand that, you'll never solve this problem. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure it can be solved, but you can't even manage it. You can't even manage it because there's a religious motivation there that if they can't back away from it, they will never give up trying to destroy Israel as long as those leaders are in charge.
Yeah. Let me ask you, having said that, Israel has been in so many wars since 1948, at least a dozen wars where they've been attacked and have had to fight, for their own freedom. Yeah. How would you characterize what's taking place at this time in this war? Have things changed and has it moved, the peg down a little bit more? And how do you see that in terms of last days events, prophetic events? Do you think, are you seeing something that connects in all of that?
I'm not a real expert on prophecy. What I know from Scripture is there are very clear prophecies in the Old Testament that have been fulfilled. There are many messianic prophecies. Isaiah 53 is one of my favorites that I think very clearly and specifically refers to Jesus. I think there are other prophecies that are being fulfilled at the present time. I don't think you can read Amos chapter 9 and not see in the current existing nation of Israel a fulfillment of prophecy. It talks about this, the reaper will outpace the sower of seed and the mountains will drip with sweet wine. There are prophecies about desert being turned into garden. That's happening in Israel right now. So I don't have a doubt that there are prophecies that are being fulfilled at the present time. I also believe that there are prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled in the future. Revelation 21, I saw a new heavens and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away and the sea was no more. Then I saw the new Jerusalem, the holy city, coming down out of heaven, adorned prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God is making his dwelling with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, for the previous things have passed away." As far as I can tell, that prophecy has not yet been fulfilled.
Not there yet.
I look forward to it. But by the way, John wasn't just making that up out of his head. That wording comes directly from the book of Isaiah and from other places, like one of the books that's not in the Protestant canon, Tobit, but is in the Catholic canon, describes the New Jerusalem in detail. So those events have not yet happened. So prophecies past, present, future, that I know about. Now, what you asked about the war front, this is tricky because there are multiple war fronts that Israel is engaged in at the present time. The war front with Hamas, which is taking place inside this small territory of Gaza, we call the Gaza Strip, 7 miles wide, 25 miles long, right on the Mediterranean coast on the southwest side of Israel. That's one war front. But the war with Hezbollah, which could be much more dangerous to Israel, Hezbollah has 100,000 trained fighters trained by Iran and equipped with 100,000 missiles. There are more missiles than Israel could ever shoot down using its Iron Dome system.
Yeah.
And that that border is right at Israel's north. So the rockets that Hezbollah is preparing now can shoot all the way down to the places you've been in the Galilee, where you stayed in those hotels in Tiberias and places like that. The other war front is with Iran. Now, that's if you could drive it would be a long day's drive. It's startling. I think about it. I could drive, say, from Colorado Springs to St. Louis, and that's the distance. I can drive that. If you could drive it, you could arrive in Iran. And Iran has, oh my word, is it 100 times the landmass, something like that?
Yep.
It's an extraordinarily large, very oil-rich country. And they've committed all of their resources to defeating all of these resources to these Hezbollah fighters to defeat Israel. Syria is a potential war front because they have brought in all of the Afghan fighters and equipped them, and they could at any moment send them to Israel. The West Bank is actually a war front. There are 40,000 armed fighters in the West Bank who despise Israel's policing of the West Bank. So any of these situations could break into a war at any time. What that portends for the other nations of the world getting involved is very difficult to say. The international alignments have changed, as you know, through the years. At Israel's founding, it was not the United States that armed Israel, it was Russia. They took all of the weapons that had been captured from the Nazis during World War II and sold them to the Israelis. The reason the 30-some thousand Israeli fighters prevailed in 1948 was due to the Czechoslovakians with the support of the Russians. Right. Americans did not get involved until the Israelis had a winning cause. Yep. And then they got involved. But, what's Russia interested in doing now? Would they get involved? Would the United States be involved? I don't see a scenario in which the United States is going to send any fighters there. But we send a lot of weapons there. We do that right now. What will Egypt do? Right now it's peaceful. Right now it's peaceful with Jordan. But the king of Jordan's hold on power, as far as I can tell, is tenuous. His people are extremely poor, and they're not happy. And they hate Jews.
Yeah. No, they're lined up on the borders. They're ready to go.
95% of them hate Jews. So what stops them? I think they still look back with resentment at the fact that they don't control the West Bank. What will happen? It's very hard to say. The question I think we have to ask is, does Israel have a legitimate right to exist?
Right.
And then I think a sub-question to that is it ever going to be possible to manage the peace in the region as long as Hamas exists as a military and governing force? And I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
And then, as you and we talked about this in my office, I don't believe as a Christian that God is done with the Jewish people. I don't look at the New Testament and think, oh, well, God's grafted them out and grafted me in, good on me because I'm with the good guys. No, it's God's root. It's God's root. God alone decides who gets grafted in and grafted out. And I feel blessed that the Christians have been grafted in. But I do not believe, as I look at even at the landscape of revivalism that's taking place in the land right now,
right,
and think that, we just have to abandon these people. This is a hopeless cause.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up the idea of, what constitutes a just war? Do they have a right to fight this war? Do they have a right to defend themselves?
Yeah.
And you talk about that a lot in the book, in one of your sections. And I wonder if you could just comment on that, given the fact that everybody immediately starts calling for a ceasefire just a few days after they massacre everybody, and they want Israel to stop. And does Israel have a just cause in doing this? I mean, you laid that out in 3 points pretty nicely in the book, and you can comment on it better than I can.
I'm happy to comment on it. Let me say, just by way of background, that just war is something that Christian thinkers have been contemplating for centuries.
Yeah.
Even millennia. You go all the way back to Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas. That was 700 years ago. These individuals thought through the whole idea of a just war very carefully. They knew that war was evil. It's always evil. But they believed that justice can prevail in situations that are evil. We have crime, but that doesn't mean we can't have policing. We have corruption in government. That doesn't mean we can't have accountability. We have evil that takes place. That doesn't mean that we can't justly respond, that our warriors can't justly respond. And they distinguish very clearly between a just peace and an unjust peace, a shameful peace. A just peace is one in which righteousness prevails when right is done. An unjust peace, or a shameful peace, is a peace in which evil is allowed to prevail. To those thinkers, Aquinas and Augustine specifically, they did not believe that death is the worst thing that happens in a war, because we all die eventually. They believe that if evil is allowed to prevail, that is the worst possible outcome. Now, they developed the whole system of thinking about just war, and I summarized it in 3 points. This is based on the work of one of my students, Dr. Eric Patterson, who's a leading expert on the topic, and was actually back in his college days, was a janitor at Summit Ministries, helping us out during the summertime program. Wonderful to see his work. Dr. Patterson has said that there are 3 aspects to this, that a legitimate nation has a just cause pursued with right intent. Those 3 things are super important. It's a legitimate nation. So a lot of people right off the bat are going to say everything Israel does is a war crime because they don't believe that Israel's a legitimate nation to begin with.
Right.
Right? Second, that it has a just cause. An attack of the nature of the October 7th attack is a just cause, especially when you think of the history of Hamas and Israel. Hamas sponsored the deaths of so many, I think somewhere around 750 people in suicide bombings in Israel. They have sent 30,000 rockets into Israel. An extraordinary, just the significant discipline of Israel not to respond with overwhelming force with all of these kinds of things happening it's unfathomable for me.
Right. Try that in Texas, right?
That's right. Yes. So the example I use in the book is, imagine that gangs came over from Mexico into San Diego and killed and raped and mutilated 42,000 people and took 15,000 hostages.
Yep.
Would we demand a reckoning? We absolutely would, and we would be right to do so. So I do believe that Israel has a just cause. The question always comes down to whether it's a right intent. A lot of people in the international community claim that Israel's intent is to commit genocide against the Gazans. As I went there and examined the facts of the situation, I concluded that entire lawsuit from South Africa is specious and very questionable how it came about. Right. And that Israel is not pursuing a genocidal agenda. Remember, intent is the key. Does Israel intend to kill all Gazans? Well, there are certain things that, according to the International Convention on Genocide, which was done by the United Nations at the close of World War II, there are certain things like preventing people from having children, destroying all of their crops so that they starve to death, intentionally killing people because they are a member of a group. None of this has been done toward Gazans. Israel's attacks have been on Hamas. They've been extraordinarily disciplined. Unfortunately, civilians have died. Civilians always die in a time of war. This has always been true. That does not mean that it's nice that it's happening or that we somehow just shrug, but it does happen. In urban warfare situations in history, 9 civilians or non-combatants are killed for every 1 fighter killed in typical urban warfare situations. Israel has, throughout the entire war, from October 7th to the present time, kept the non-combatant casualties down to 1 non-combatant who's died for every 1 combatant who has been killed. That has never happened before. John Spencer, who's America's leading expert on protecting non-combatants in a time of war, has said that Israel has done a better job protecting non-combatants than any army in history, including the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Including their own people, right? In Gaza, you have Hamas putting their own people in front of them in harm's way.
Hamas has no conception of a just war. And a lot of people don't know this, but I'll tell you why. You've heard news reports that Hamas says the death total is this, and they always say, but Gaza Health Ministry does not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Very few people have stopped to ask the question, why don't they distinguish? And the answer is the Gaza Health Ministry is an agency of Hamas. They say nothing unless Hamas tells them or permits them to say it. Those death figures are approved and come from Hamas. They aren't true. I mean, a lot of people have died. There's no question about that. But we have no idea how many, because any statistical analysis of the death totals and the way they were unveiled shows that it's statistically impossible that actually happened in that way. Yeah. But why don't they distinguish? Because Hamas believes that every person who dies in self-defense of the Ummah, of the global community of Islam. All deaths are self-defense. If a person runs down a street with a rifle and gets shot by an IDF soldier, that person has died in self-defense. They are not a combatant. They are a martyr. People who never carried a weapon in their lives, if they die, they are martyrs. That is how Hamas sees it. So again, if you just try to understand this from a geopolitical standpoint, you'll never get it. You'll never understand what's happening. You have to think theopolitically.
Yeah. And there's somebody in that theopolitical, environment that is really generating all of this. You know, it's like we always say, when God said to Abraham, I choose you, Satan was there, and he said, I choose you too.
Wow. It's powerful.
Dr. Myers, this book is phenomenal. Mine's all marked up. Yours is marked up.
Mine's marked up.
But you're asking the question, should Christians support Israel? We would say, well, of course they should, but why does this book with this question need to be asked? Is there a lack of this? And if so, how do Christians support Israel?
The question needed to be asked because the rising generation has a very different view of all of this. And because nothing that's happening with Israel versus the Palestinian cause, if you will, we have a whole other show on what that means. This is not your grandparents' Israel-Palestine conflict. Hamas is a brand new agent in all of this. That changes the entire dynamic. It shifts the paradigm. So I watch Gen Z say they prefer Hamas, which they know is an apocalyptic rape and death cult. At least a lot of them know it, over the United States as ally. Why? It's about the United States. It's about Judeo-Christian civilization itself. They want to see the takedown of Judeo-Christian civilization. Therefore, Israel is not just about Israel. It's not just about a strip of land in the Middle East. It's about everything everywhere. It is an epic battle of worldviews in which truth is dramatically under attack at this moment. Yeah. That's why I think the question needed to be asked. And young adults' support of Israel is so low you can't even believe it. Even among young evangelicals, its support for Israel is dropped by half among young evangelicals just within the last 5 years. Yeah, the anti-Israel forces are dominating the conversation, even on evangelical Christian college campuses at this time, with only a handful of exceptions like Colorado Christian University and Arizona Christian University, Liberty University, and a lot of these other places. The pro or the anti, I was going to say pro-Palestine, but that's not an accurate statement. It's anti-Israel sentiment is dominating the discussion. So they needed to be asked this question, and I needed to present them with the facts, to do it in as gracious of a way as possible, but to present the facts of the situation. And that's what I sought to do in that book. I think that Israel needs to be supported at this time. I do not believe that it's anti-Semitic to disagree with this or that Israeli policy. Mm-hmm. When you go to Israel, you realize there are a lot of disagreements on the ground there.
Well, that's one of the finest of Jewish traditions, is to not agree.
That's right. Yeah. One of my Jewish friends says, if you have two Jews, you'll have 5 opinions.
Yeah. And what we say, we take that a level further and say that all he needs is himself. He doesn't even agree with himself sometimes.
That's right. I don't even agree with myself half the time. Yeah.
I resemble that remark.
Well, there are 55 political parties in Israel for 9 million people. 15 of them have seats in the Knesset, which is their parliament. Right. This is not a country where people agree with one another on everything. They find a path through the disagreement. I think that's a critically important call for Americans at this point in history.
Yeah. Well, and you know what is really significant in all of that? And you're talking about, the Gen Z group that has, kind of taken a left turn here somewhere. And I just read a report that in this upcoming election, it's going to be different than it has been in any other, because Gen Z represents 117 million voters, new voters coming into the process, while the older generation has 70,000 voters.
70 million.
Million.
Yeah. Well, there will be, I don't know how many people will be voting in this upcoming election. Hopefully people are all voting at the local level, state level, federal level. You could have 100 million votes out there. Mm-hmm. And there are going to be more and more every single year from Gen Z. Right now, there may be 15% of the population, but they're 100% of the future. If it's true, as we talked about earlier in the show, that they are being victimized by propaganda, even if they're willing victims, even if they want to believe it, that still needs to be addressed. Colossians 2:8, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of the world rather than on Christ.
Dr. Myers, there's something special we get to offer the listeners and the audience for the Jewish Road, and that is a copy of their own book.
Yes.
How do we make that happen?
You can get that book as a gift from Summit Ministries. If you want to pitch in for the shipping and handling, we will not object. Mm-hmm. But we have these books have already been paid for by somebody who really wants to help get the truth out there. So you just go to summit.org/Israel, and you can request a copy of Should Christians Support Israel? I want to emphasize this too. The people who are watching or listening to this show are exactly the kind of people we want to get this book into the hands of. But we need you to not keep the secret to yourself. Right. If you read the book and you think, this is really an important message, I need to help. Yes, you do. You do. You need to get back in touch with us, figure out how to get multiple copies of the book to distribute, especially to the young adults you know and love. They need to be reading, not just watching TikTok videos. They need to be considering the facts. Even if they end up disagreeing with my conclusions, they need to consider them, because right now they're just getting a one-sided indoctrination, and that is not an acceptable way to run a constitutional republic.
Well, what we've seen is the sins of our fathers is that we remain silent when we should have said something. And so what we stand for and what our ministry stands for is that we're not going to be silent, especially in times like this, and that God is up to something and his plan eventually will be laid out. It's being laid out as we see it right now. And we're so thankful just for your contribution here, for your support and your stand with the Jewish people. We didn't have many friends to begin with, and it's even less now these days. And so thank you for standing with Israel. Thank you for this important work. Not just what you're doing with Summit Ministries, which again is just an incredible ministry, but specifically with this ministry through this book in particular. So thank you for being here with us
Ron
today.
And Matt, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation when you came to visit Colorado, and I'm glad we were able to record a show here. Now I'm just praying that lots and lots of people will get the message and then hand it on to their friends.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for being here, and more to come. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.